everybody. So Martin asked me to, to make some remarks at this conference and provide some of my own observations about the promises and challenges of combining social and genetic information to gain a better understanding about the life course and the causes of life chances and life course outcomes. And when he asked me to do this, my response was, I'm sort of an interesting choice, Martin, because the conference is about social and genetic causes of life chances. And while I've done a lot of research in my life, that my research has not been of the form that explicitly grapples with genetic information and the role of the genotype in producing life course outcomes. Martin's very persuasive, and he nonetheless persuaded me to talk. And I do, of course, have expertise in studying the life course and in studying environmental determinants of life course outcomes. When I approached this, I took the position of a scholar who cares deeply about the sources of inequality and ways to reduce inequality. And I tried to be in some pure sense disinterested about the importance or unimportance of explicitly considering the genotype when attempting to address fundamental questions in sociology, social stratification, and life course research. I was already persuaded that it was a good idea from a research perspective, but as I said, I'm trying to sort of adopt a disinterested approach in the context of this talk. His assignment motivated me to read what I would call a healthy portion of the behavioral genetics literature. And so I think I have some reasonable understanding of what's going on and hopefully a useful perspective on the current state of affairs from the perspective of a sociologist who's primarily concerned with the effects of environmental conditions on life chances and with how the size of these effects varies in the population of interest. So a couple of words on why we do life course research and study social inequality, and I think it's fair to say that we have descriptive and analytical and policy goals. The descriptive goals are important. We want to know how much, for example, poverty there is in a society, how much unemployment, how much wealth, how much social capital. We want to know about friends, marriages, happiness and unhappiness, how much of those things there are and how much inequality there is in these quantities, how the distribution of these aspects of life change both over the life course of individuals and over time for populations and societies. And then we have analytical goals, and our analytical goals are to understand the determinants of major life course outcomes, to understand the distribution of these outcomes, and to understand the reasons for change in both individual outcomes and in these distributions over the life course and across history. And then from a policy perspective, we generally have preferences to improve the quality of life and have some hope that scholarly research in the social sciences can work through policy to do that. Improving the quality of life for at least some of us, we see as connected with the reduction of inequality in society, because there's an awful lot of inequality at this point. And we think that that inequality has negative consequences, or at least we have suspicions that it does for at least some aspects of social life and for some important groups in society. But regardless, we wish to understand what actions at both the individual and the institutional level can be taken in order to improve outcomes. Recognizing that social policy entails costs, we want to know whether the benefits justify the costs. And especially in the context of this conference, we understand that the causes of life chances and life outcomes are partly the result of biological processes, and partly of social and institutional processes, also known as the environment. And we want to understand how big are the effects of these processes and what are the mechanisms that link cause and effect. Now, even those of us who have not paid a lot of attention to the biology, so to speak, of life chances, already knew that it's difficult to determine environmental effects with observational data because of endogeneity, i.e. the fact that there's non-random assignment of individuals to environments. The theme of this conference calls attention to the endogeneity that happens for genetic reasons through passive or active gene-environment correlations. Of course, that's not the only type of endogeneity that challenges us in our quest to get the right answers. So I'm going to begin my observations with a couple of useful, or at least I'm hoping, useful stimuli. I'm going to make some framing remarks about life chances and life course research from an environmental perspective. And then I'm going to turn to the question, at least from my perspective, of how genetic-aware research changes the framing focus and possibly answers or not. And I'm going to begin with a couple of what I think are useful starting points. And one of them, which I think is especially salient given the location of this conference, is a recent review paper that Carl Ulrich Meyer wrote. This was in 2009, where he provided a review of life course research in the Annual Review of Sociology. I think it was called New Directions in Life Course Research. And then I'm going to give another sort of perspective which is related, which is connected to an important foundation in the United States called the W.T. Grant Foundation, which has a new president, Adam Gameron, who's a fellow traveler in stratification research for the sociologists in this room. And they started a new research initiative on the idea of reducing inequality. You know, as I said, I think especially given a conference that's co-organized by Martin Diewald, that it's appropriate to start with Meyers' review article. Meyers' 2009 review is largely disconnected from the emerging literature on the correlations, interactions, and additive effects of the genotype in the environment and life course outcomes. But nonetheless, it provides a good overview of both longstanding and recent life course sociology. It's a good starting point for my observations today because it allows a consideration of whether and how questions change and whether and how answers change when genetic variables receive full consideration along with environmental ones. And Meyer organized his review essay around two questions, and his questions were, first, he asked, and I'm quoting, how stable are certain socioeconomic characteristics and behavior across the larger lifespan? And this is a descriptive question. It's a question about the extent of mobility, the extent of mobility on important socioeconomic outcomes. Is it high? Is it low? And is it turbulent? And then he had a second question, which he framed as, how can we best understand the dynamics of life course trajectories? And he went on to ask, do early conditions of childhood, adolescence, and early adulthood have direct impacts on middle and later adulthood, as well as the retirement years and old age, which are not accounted for by the crucial intervening outcomes like educational attainment, career entry, and family formation? And he specified the question also by asking, can events and conditions in adulthood significantly alter further trajectories and outcomes? And even though Meyer explicitly framed the second question in terms of what he called direct effects, I think it's fair to interpret his concern as including the extent to which early conditions dictated future outcomes through both direct and indirect effects. So partly, in other words, his questions were about the extent to which early conditions and experiences largely determined the life course, and particularly whether early conditions determined later life, or whether subsequent environmental effects, which could include the intentional events generated by social policy, can change early trajectories. And he was also very concerned and interested in large-scale societal events, including major events such as depressions, wars, and political transformations, the kinds of things that in the demographic literature are often referred to as period effects. The question the extent to which these large-scale environmental events can sort of alter the life course. And in this article, he provided a variety of examples drawn from the recent literature about the impact of early conditions. So, for example, do the direct effects of poverty last beyond entry into adulthood? Or are there long-term direct effects of family structure during childhood on adult health or adult earnings or adult risk of unemployment? Or is there a continuing impact of family background and educational attainment and ability on occupational attainment over the life course as the work career moves forward? Or the question, what are the effects of stress in childhood on marital quality? Or the question of whether there is an intergenerational transmission of divorce risk. In other words, do children whose parents divorce thereby have a greater likelihood of divorcing themselves? And then focusing for a minute on his interest in the stability of adult lives and the possibility of change in these lives, he was interested in the extent to which deflecting events can occur that are, let's say, at the individual level, but he was also interested in the extent to which stability or change occurred through institutions. So, for example, the question of the extent to which stability of adult lives is enhanced through educational systems that create clear pathways to school leaving credentials that have specific value in the labor market via educational licensing or labor market structures that produce occupational closure. Or stability that comes from labor market structures that make it difficult for employers to terminate employees. Or stability that comes through social insurance policies that stabilize income via unemployment insurance or job retraining and other active labor market policies. These are the kinds of things that can create differences in the level of stability of adult lives in one country versus another, taking, for example, Sweden versus Germany versus the United States. And then he was interested in the issue of historical change and what is the impact of large-scale historical change on the stability of the life course of the cohorts that experience it. And two obvious examples that he talks about is the classic study that Glenn Elder did called Children of the Great Depression, which was a study of the impact of the Depression on the adult lives of the cohorts who grew up during this turbulent time. And another important example is the work of Martin Diewald on the consequences of the transformation of East Germany after reunification, the consequences on East German life courses, and the impact of this transformation for the effects of individual resources on outcomes, that is, for the effects of qualifications or the effects of gender or age or party membership on life course outcomes such as unemployment or earnings. And because institutional change can change these effects, it can produce upward or downward mobility that is complicated because these effects can be heterogeneous. Now, as I said, I think at the, when I brought up Meyers' review, he didn't have that much to say in this piece on genetics and the impact of genetic research on studies of the life course. He made a couple of remarks in passing, and I think they're just useful to bring in because the 2009 is not that long ago. And he argued in 2009 that one might have expected more cooperation between life course sociology and biological or psychological processes. But he said that it hasn't happened to the extent one might have expected. And on the specific issue of genetics, Meyer argued that, I'm quoting here, life course sociology tended to ignore the biological foundations of social events and transitions. And he went on to say that recent progress in understanding genetic and biological influences on life course trajectories has been what he called largely conceptual and programmatic, even as he saw potential for substantive progress in the future. Okay, so next some framing comments using this reducing inequality frame. So Meyers' focus on stability and change and on the long-term consequences of early life events and on the susceptibility of life courses to institutional forces and institutional change has a clear relationship to a long-standing focus of American research on the causes of poverty and on reducing poverty. And in recent years, this focus has been enhanced by a broader focus on the issue of reducing inequality as first scholars and then the general public and then in the political dialogue became more aware of the rising inequality that characterizes the United States, but also much of the industrialized world. And the presumption of this research approach is, has clear parallels with the life course paradigm that I just talked about. So, from this perspective, social, cultural, and human capital resources in adulthood are produced by exposing children throughout their childhood lives to resource-rich environments. So parental socialization and education of children via what Annette Leroux referred to as concerted cultivation can produce security, stimulation, and encourage psychological and physical health. Raising children in safe, pleasant, and resource-rich neighborhoods and communities will have positive effects on the development of children. Being raised in these communities raises the chance that children form peer relationships with advantaged children, which enhances their social capital, which becomes an asset in the status attainment process. Sending children who live in these resource-rich neighborhoods to resource-rich schools that have quality educational instruction, that have stimulating after-school activities, and stimulating summer programs in both the athletic and the academic arenas, enhance educational prospects and outcomes, which are, of course, linked to labor market returns. And in this educational process, these children are provided with information about how the educational process works, how one achieves success in school, and how one uses school to achieve labor market success, which is, I would say, relatively more important in the American context, which tends to have a less sort of channeled educational system than one has in Germany. So this information is actually harder to come by and is more unequally distributed. These children, as they grow up, are taught how to form good, stable, and loving relationships, which raises the chances for successful and stable marriages, which itself, aside from the benefits of marriage per se, has important, powerful impacts on standard of living and well-being. And then meanwhile, the parents and the teachers of these children are alert to signs of trouble of either a physical or psychological form, and they intervene with the use of medical and psychological professionals to steer children away from dysfunction and back towards a healthy development path. And these multiple sort of environmental inputs provide academic success and physical and psychological health leads to high levels of educational attainment, relatively high standards of living, good health, good relationships, an overall high quality of life, and also a long life. And there's actually this interesting debate going on in the US right now about the Social Security system and whether it is in fiscal trouble, financial trouble, and the position on the right is one should raise the, amongst other things, raise the retirement age. People on the left point out that and on the right they say raise the retirement age because people are living longer, and people on the left are pointing out that the people who are living longer are the advantaged people, that the disadvantaged population is in fact not living longer at all. So the reducing inequality frame acknowledges the existence of unequal starting points, okay, but it presumes the possibility of environmental shocks that are not purely endogenous to early individual level conditions, and that could raise the outcomes of those who otherwise would experience low or negative outcomes in terms of mental health, educational attainment, incarceration, family dysfunction, or income, and has the idea that these environmental shocks can be generated. Now, maybe they can be generated by local actors or the local community, or maybe by specific policy interventions. So the research question becomes, what kinds of changes to the environments of disadvantaged children would produce significant gains in academic achievement and reductions in behavior problems to produce better adult outcomes? Raising questions about a whole variety of potential interventions. So for example, universal preschool, or summer academic programs, or interventions that counsel parents on better ways of raising their children, interventions providing better information about neighborhoods and school quality to enhance choice, programs that attempt to reduce housing discrimination, which otherwise leads minorities to be concentrated in poor neighborhoods, that produces neighborhood deterioration and all the negative consequences of that, or interventions that might lead to higher levels of trust between disadvantaged children and local authorities, including teachers, police, social service professionals, etc., with the idea being that a better understanding of the size of these environmental effects might lead to cost-effective policies that would produce better outcomes for disadvantaged children and thereby reduce inequality. And there, I would say also is a kind of a guiding research orientation of this reducing inequality frame, which includes awareness of and attention to the challenges of causal inference, awareness of and attention to the reality that causal effects are both hard to estimate because people are typically non-randomly selected into or select themselves into whatever we're referring to as the treatment, and an awareness of and attention to the fact that these effects, even if we were able to estimate them accurately, are heterogeneous in the population, and they vary with observable characteristics, they vary with unobservable characteristics, and they also vary with the probability of selection into treatment. So then I asked the question, what changes with genetics-aware models? And a few things change, and I've put the list here on this slide of what I see as the most important. So one is that genetics-aware models provide the ability to separate the proportion of population variance in a trait or behavior or outcome of interest to the additive effects of the genotype and the shared environment. Genetics-aware models provide awareness that estimates of family background effects in particular and environmental effects in general are typically endogenous to genetic effects as well as whatever else they may be endogenous to. They offer the possibility the future vision that researchers may identify the specific genes that alone or in combination with other genes explain much of the heritability component of population variance. They raise the possibility that this genetic information can be used to better estimate the causal effect of environmental factors so that those who are interest is purely in the impact of the environment, therefore become interested in genetic aware models in order to be able to actually figure out what the effect of the environment is. They raise the possibility that genetic information can be used to better understand the heterogeneity of these causal effects, including both the heterogeneity and the causal effects of the genetic variables themselves, but also the heterogeneity and the causal effects of environmental variables. But then the question is like, how much will we really learn from this enterprise? My reading of the literature is that it's rapidly moving. Number one, it's fascinating, it's stimulating. It's frustrating. In fact, one could even say it's depressing in certain respects if one was hoping for, so to speak, a quick fix by those of us trying to understand the effects of the environment and hoping that genetic information could be used to get a definitive handle on what those environmental effects are. One gets the impression that we find that we know that what research has shown that we know less than we thought we knew, and that the path to knowing more is very challenging because the data requirements are enormous, because the causal structure is massively complex, even more complex than some of us realized. And the concern that simple approximations don't capture enough of the truth to be either very true or very useful. And there's obviously a lot that is on reasonably firm ground, especially struck by Turkheimer's 3 laws of behavioral genetics, that I'm sure everyone in the room knows, that all behavior is to some extent heritable, that the effect of genes is generally greater than the effect of being raised in the same family, and that a substantial portion of the variance in behavior is due to neither genes nor common family experience, but that this non-shared environment factor is extremely idiosyncratic. But getting more specific information seems to be very challenging. The number of specific genes is very large. The number of SNPs is much larger. The effects of these causal variants may not be additive, probably isn't, and in any case are interactive with the environment, which makes the sample sizes needed for establishing true correlations to be very large, and the need for even more data to move from establishing correlation to establishing causation. My special concern, as I said at the start, is to understand how genetic information can shed light on the causal effect of environmental factors. But using genes to somehow, or genetic information more broadly, to somehow identify the true state, the true size of the effects of environmental variables is challenging for a variety of reasons. We can't just control for the genes or the SNPs that are affecting the outcome of interest because researchers can't find the ones that matter, or at least can't find all the ones that matter in a form that's useful for statistical analysis. There is a recent paper by Yang et al. That was studying the heritability of height. And this paper noted that while twin studies produce an estimate for heritability of height of about 80%, that gene-wide association studies on tens of thousands of individuals have found about 50 SNPs that together explain only 5% of the phenotypic variance. I found the Yang et al. Paper very remarkable in their ability to show that 250,000 SMPs taken together can account for 45% of the variance. Not all of it, but maybe because, as they point out, in a sophisticated way, that they don't have a strong enough, there isn't a strong enough association between the SMPs and the underlying causal variance. So controlling for the known SMPs doesn't get us very far in terms of controlling for additive genetic effects. We obviously can't control for 250,000 variables in order, in some sense, to control for the genotype, to remove its influence, the endogeneity bias that's coming from it in our efforts to understand environmental effects. We also can't use instrumental variable methods with these variables either. And again, because we don't know enough. First of all, the exclusion restriction is almost certainly violated for genetic information. It may be affecting the environment, but it's probably affecting the outcome of interest directly as well. And we have a very unclear idea at this point what the various pathways are that connect the genotype to the outcome of interest. And second, the instruments would be very weak even if they were valid instruments. And this leaves fixed effects methods as the most, let's say, straightforwardly promising use of genetic information if your main goal is to understand and accurately estimate the effect of environmental variance on outcomes. Though these methods have problems as well, and I'm just going to illustrate those as I talk a little bit about what I'm going to refer to as the genetics enhanced version of of the Blau-Duncan model, which for the sociologists needs no introduction, but the status attainment model as it's understood in sociology. In fact, this is the Wisconsin, this is a stripped down version of the what's so-called Wisconsin model because it has cognitive ability in the model as well, and I guess, whoops, sorry, I guess I don't have a pointer here. Okay, there's no pointer. So there's cognitive ability there, and over here is sort of like the Mincer model, the Mincer earnings function, which is part of the Wisconsin model as well. And the S's there are the, does it work? Oh, okay. There we go. Okay. And the S's are the paths that the sociologists and economists think about when they try to estimate this model. And then I put all these G's here, which are all these gene environment correlations, which are providing potential endogeneity, messing up, I will call them naive estimates of these paths. So the question is, like, how much do they mess them up, and how can the genetic information be used to do better? So, what we thought we knew was that family background has a considerable, but not deterministic effect on educational attainment, and that each year of education is worth about 10% higher earnings. So let's first talk about the issue of the family environment effects on cognitive ability. And I'm cherry picking from my reading to provide, well, at one level there's uncertainty about a lot of this. The more articles you read, that there's always a kind of a confidence interval that comes from comparing one article to another. But I think it's fair to say, and those who know this literature more can of course challenge this in the discussion, that heritability is high, around 0.5, though there seems to be a range on it. But there's disagreement in the literature, in fact, really sharp disagreement about the shared environment effect and its persistence into adulthood. Nisbet et al. Did a recent review article on what we know about intelligence. And in that article, I think they referred to Haworth's recent analysis of 11,000 pairs of twins from 4 countries, which found that 16% of young adult twin IQ could be explained by shared environment. The Nisbet et al. Paper reported in their comparison of IQs for children who were adopted into upper middle class versus lower SES parents, and they reported a 12 to 18 point increase in IQ, depending upon the study that one was looking at, which I would sort of roughly translate as a 1 standard deviation increase in IQ for a 3 standard deviation shift in SES from somewhere close to disadvantage to upper middle class. And that sort of translates to a standardized effect of about 0.33, which is about 11% of the variance, which turns out to be not so far out of line, actually, with the Wisconsin model from the 70s. So Sewell and Hauser, in their study of the Wisconsin longitudinal data, found that father's occupation, father's education, mother's education, and family income accounted for 10% in mental ability. And Marks, in a 2013 book, which reviews a lot of this literature, reports several more recent studies in this same range. And then meanwhile, and in keeping with current expectations in the social science literature, Nisbet et al., after reviewing some work, concluded that they thought it was reasonable to conclude that the effects of both genes and the environment are heterogeneous. Okay, so again, going back to this model, so we talked about this, and then we're going to talk about, I'm going to talk about education. So the issue of environmental ability effects on educational attainment. So in a famous book from the 70s, Jenks's Inequality, in a more recent analysis of the NLSY data by Greg Duncan et al. And a paper by Zagorski, all of these find correlations between cognitive ability and educational attainment in the 0.5 to 0.6 range, and found that about 30% of the variance can be explained by cognitive ability. And then if we go back to Hauser and Featherman, who analyzed a famous data set in the United States called OCG2, the Blau and Duncan book was on the OCG data, which was collected in 1962. The US Census replicated it in 1973. That's called OCG2. Much of Hauser's career was analyzing these data. And Hauser and Featherman in 76 reported that after correcting for measurement error in OCG2, they could account for 2/3 of the variance in American male educational attainment by a common family factor, and they could account for about 1/3 of the variance using measured SES variables of the kind that I showed you in the previous slide. Now, newer genetically aware studies find smaller environmental effects, but they are hardly zero. And a recent paper by Brannigan et al. That are reviewed, looked at studies for many countries, computed a grand mean of heritability estimates of educational attainment across these studies as 0.4. And actually their estimate of the grand mean of the shared environment was 0.36, which actually was not so out of line with the Jenks, Duncan, and Hauser and Featherman results. I was actually surprised to see. So a recap of those two previous slides, that the SES affected cognitive ability of maybe 11% of the variance, which was what Nisbet et al. Found, and the shared environment effect on young adults of about 16% of Haworth et al. It's qualitatively similar to standard estimates from the status attainment literature. And the shared environment effect in educational attainment of 0.36 that Brannigan et al. Found in 2013 is qualitatively similar to standard estimates from status attainment models on family effects. So these newer studies are clearly increasing our understanding, but there's no definitive overturning, so to speak, of prior results, at least Not yet. And then the issue of like, what about the effects of education on wages? Okay, well, it's studies of twins, allow for one to control for all the ways that twins are the same by doing fixed effects models, which the behavioral genetics literature, quite clearly points out. The point that's important to know is that this isn't news to the economics and sociology literature. There's a long tradition of doing this, in particular in economics, in terms of trying to figure out, one of the sort of core problems, let's say, in human capital theory, which is how big an impact does education have on earnings, recognizing that you run these models and there's unmeasured aspects of the people in these studies that may themselves be correlated with earnings, for example, ability, which raises questions as to whether the OLS estimates that one gets of the effects of education on earnings are in fact the causal effects. And this literature has been going on for a long time. Grilkes, for example, in '79, there's lots of articles, but Ashenfelter and Kruger in '94, Ashenfelter and Rouse in '98, Bound and Solon in '99, and Neumark in 1999, to name just a few examples. And there's actually a corresponding tradition in sociology which involves extensions of the status attainment model. There were many studies done of twins and siblings in the Wisconsin data. And the question, so what are the results of these studies? Well, they're not definitive, I think is the simple answer. They're useful, they're very useful, but they're not definitive and they're not necessarily better than the results that one obtains using other methods. And why does the literature conclude that? Well, on the plus side, the fixed effects models with twins removes bias from unmeasured variables. But as it's long been known about fixed effects models, they also magnify the effects of measurement error, because in a standard regression, when there's measurement error on the independent variable, it produces downward bias, typically in the estimate of that effect of that on the outcome. And whatever the error is on the level of the variable, when you do fixed effects and you difference, you're differencing signal, and thereby magnifying noise, which is magnifying bias, which is offsetting the benefits of reducing bias by using the fixed effects model in the first place. And you don't, by using even twins, you don't necessarily, in fact, you don't generally even remove the ability effects, even though you've controlled for their identical genotypes, because there's lots of ways that twins can have residual ability differences. And while those residual ability differences are small relative to the ability that one is controlling through the fixed effects, one has this problem that these residual unobserved ability effects are potentially contaminating the dependent variable, which is differences in educational attainment, which has substantially reduced variance because of the high correlation in educational attainment of twins. And so one is magnifying bias. And the bottom line is that whether the answer that you get is better or worse than the answer that you get using OLS models depends on a set of assumptions and how big those potential biases are, which themselves can't directly be established. So the bottom line is that the results from fixed effects models are useful, but not definitive. They haven't stopped the search for natural experiment strategies to identify the effects of education on wages. And the results that these models have given turn out to be not that different from OLS results. So in conclusion, where does this leave us? So, you know, my take on the literature is that adding genetic information is a great boon for understanding life course outcomes, and in particular for understanding how the environment affects life course outcomes. And I would say that, you know, from the environment, from the genetic side of the equation, as an outsider, I would say it's a revolution. From the environmental side of the equation, it's clearly a gain, though I don't yet know if it's a revolution. Those of us interested in the effects of environments will look at the potential of genetics-aware models to better identify environmental causal effects and to provide insight into the heterogeneity of environmental causal effects. And again, here I think is another place where the genetics models can provide a lot of potential gain, because that heterogeneity of effects, whether we're talking about school interventions, neighborhood interventions, what have you, that heterogeneity may partly be understandable in terms of biological aspects of the people involved. But we need to do this, I would say, with a critical eye, and that's sort of my bottom line.